Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Altman. I'm with America Achieves, and we are very excited to bring this session to you this morning. We're really excited because this is a session that's really focused really from the ground up. We have joined today by two economic development representatives from EDA who are going to share a lot of their experiences about what makes for applications to be successful. So we have a ton that we want to cover. We're not presenting today. This is going to be a conversation about lessons learned, some pitfalls in prior applications, how to strengthen your applications. Our agenda, which is on the screen now, is that we want to cover are one, the role of EDRs and EDA regions in supporting your applications. Really critical. We want to explore that so you understand how you can effectively engage. Insights on technical issues. We're going to walk through a project life cycle, key components of a project life cycle. What have been some of the successes in terms of projects being successful, and what have been some of the pitfalls, and how to strengthen actually the projects through this process. We're going to then zoom out a little bit, zoom out, but we are zooming out on big strategic project issues in terms of what's been successful in the past. And we're going to end on how your coalitions can organize some concrete ways with EDRs and with your regions. What if the session is not? We're not here to answer the specific questions on the BBRC application today. There'll probably be lots of questions you'll want to put in the chat. We're not going to have a Q&A session because there would be so many. The real goal of this, hopefully, is that we hit a whole bunch of things that you'll say, "Ooh, I didn't thought about that," or "Ooh, I need to follow up on that." And you will go to your EDRs and to your regions and have those conversations. So this is really to stimulate those conversations. And our format, as I said, is going to be conversational. So we're going to jump in. The first part of our agenda and really get to the heart of this, which is the conversation. I'm really thrilled. I've now we've spent a number of hours together. I've gotten to know an enormous amount in a short time. We are joined by Trisha Corbis. Trisha has a long background at EDA, I think, right, Trisha, since 2003. Civil engineer by training. She's the EDR for New Mexico and West Texas, stationed in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There are incredible highlights of her career. I will just point out that in September 2013, when the flooding disaster hit in the state of Colorado, Trisha was mission assigned by FEMA to serve as the lead field coordinator for the economic recovery support function to support the state with long-term recovery. She's been through every kind of process you can imagine, construction process, EDR grants. She was a leader in actually putting out the EDA construction grant post-approval process tool, which has widely acclaimed. So we're thrilled, enormous resource. Joining her is Lee Shiri. He is the economic development representative in the Chicago office. He has been with the EDA for 11 years, and he serves the state of Michigan as the point of contact. Also long career working in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. Before that, he was involved in local economic development for over 10 years. Like me, he's a city planner by background, so I'm thrilled to have a fellow planner. So we have a really, really great conversation. So we literally could spend the whole afternoon, but we're going to focus on a couple of key things. So the first thing we want to do today is really jump in on what is the role of EDRs and the EDA regions in supporting the applications. So Trisha, I'm going to turn to you. Is why so important? What role do you play? How should regions be engaging with you if they're not, or ways they can be engaged?
Actually, I'll jump in if you don't mind,
Lee?
Andy.
Yeah, go ahead, Lee. Yeah.
First of all, congrats to all of the phase one winners. Is great opportunity here. EDA is a really unique agency that really punches above its weight class in terms of investments and impacts that it can make on regions and communities across the United States. Trisha and I are just one of numerous EDRs that are represented across the entire United States. And we're a strong army of folks that are here to help you. And I hope you take that away from this conversation today, the value that an EDR can bring to the table, because we support you from a critical project development standpoint. We work hands-on with you to kind of develop and foster applications and ideas. And so if you have not engaged your EDR to this point, you really need to. EDA is very atypical when it comes to our grants process. We are involved throughout the whole development, from idea all the way from cradle to grave of the project. And so that's very different than most federal agencies, where they'll post a notice of funding opportunity or an FFO, federal funding opportunity, and they just kind of good luck, go for the funds. We like to be hands-on. We want to support you. We want to make sure that you're putting forth a technically correct and a competitive application to support your efforts to grow your local economy. We do work with a lot of partners, and I'll turn it over to Trisha to talk a little bit about that.
That's perfectly, thanks. I want to mention too that EDA regional office staff, especially the EDRs, we work very closely with EDA designated economic development districts throughout the country. So depending on where you are located, these districts can be called different things. You may have heard of a council of governments, or a regional planning commission, or association of governments, just to name a few. We also fund several EDA designated tribes on an annual basis as well. So if your project involves a tribal region or a Native American partnership, keep that in mind as well. So we fund the districts each year to do several things, including to provide technical assistance to the communities and the region they cover, including EDA technical assistance. We also fund them to upkeep and maintain the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or CEDS, you may have heard of. So your coalition's vision and each component project for the cluster should align with this CEDS document, but we'll dive into that a little further. These districts are EDA's local and regional experts. So if you don't know what district covers your region, get in touch with your EDR and they can help make that connection. I think it's important to note too that the EDRs are generally well connected throughout their territory that they cover. Not only do we work with our districts, we also communicate frequently with representatives from the congressional delegation. We meet regularly with a myriad of state agencies. We work with tribes, cities, counties, nonprofits, universities, local EDOs as well throughout the state. So the message here is it's important to know your EDR. There may be an initiative on the other side of the state that can enhance your project, but at minimum, maybe there's a connection we can help make or another resource you can possibly leverage.
That's great.
And if you don't mind, Andy, I just want to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that. Is one of the things that EDA also is we're also housing the economic development integration model.
Right.
And so for projects that look to come to EDA that might not be either a strong fit or even might be a fit but has some funding gap issues, we have points of contact in every one of the regional offices that can search and source other federal resources, potentially even state, to kind of help move a particular initiative or project forward. So again, it might not be a fit for EDA, but we might be able to find resources for you through other federal agencies. So that's definitely another avenue for you to explore with your EDR.
Great. I think that's really helpful. And I think, look, a key message from this session for everyone is that the EDRs and the whole team and resources they can access are here to work with you. They're not just compliance officers, they are partners in trying to be creative and to help you they want to make these applications as strong as they can and as competitive as they can, because you're working on local economic development at the ground level. So whatever may be the result of this particular competition, they want to strengthen local economies, and that's their commitment. And they want to help in any way they can. They have access to resources, technical resources, other funding that can be brought in. So that is really, I think, a key message for what we want to get across today. So thank you both for articulating that. So we want to move in now and into kind of the heart of what we want to talk about, which is what's on everyone's mind, right? What makes for a good project? So there is not a formula for what makes for a good project. Let's start there. So if you're taking notes about they said these 3 things or those 4 things, that's not what we're going to do. But we want to step back from the experiences that Trisha and Lee have, what they have seen that really helps to make projects successful and where there have been pitfalls. And importantly, I think how this process, even though it's short, we know we only have a few more weeks left, it's not the end of the process, but you can still use this process to sharpen projects, change projects, you know, and evolve projects. That is part of what this is about. So what we want to go through are some of the elements of what we call the project life cycle, right? What does that mean? That means from conceptualization of a project, who are your applicants, right? Your co-applicants rather, the partners that are going to be involved, to nitty-gritty issues of land control. Are you building a building? What happens post-occupancy? All those kinds of things. We're going to kind of highlight some areas of strength and some areas where people have gotten into trouble with some of those issues. So with that, let's start with the first thing. And Lee and Trisha, we hear a lot about not a cookie cutter project, right? That there's no, as I said, one formula. There's not, what is the EDA, you know, the absolute cookie cutter that we want, and we'll do that. These are projects from all over the regions, all different kinds of creative projects, some more advanced, some more early stage. So let's talk about what makes a strong project in terms of project proposals from the start. And I know you both have great examples. So I thought what we'll do is maybe just tell a little bit of some couple case studies that'll frame this discussion before we get into some of the details. And I don't know, Lee, Trisha, who would like to kick off?
Well, I'll jump into that. So, and thanks, Andy, for that. As Andy mentioned, you may be asking, what's a good example of a good EDA project? And you know, it really depends on the region's needs. As Andy mentioned, there's no cookie cutter project. EDA is traditionally known for funding projects such as industrial parks, business parks, roads, water, sewer, even business incubators and bricks and mortar projects. But while these may be our bread and butter construction projects, so to speak, we fund projects that are locally driven, that are organic, and they don't come from the top down. A good example of a non-traditional locally driven project is one I remember from a little over 15 years ago in northern New Mexico, where EDA funded the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad Commission. And we awarded a public works construction grant for the rehabilitation of 3 historic steam locomotives. So that winter, while the trains were dormant, for the first time, the locomotive engineers didn't have to relocate their families to central New Mexico to find employment. And they increased the staff in the machine shop as well. In addition to that job retention, because we helped put more trains online, their regional marketing efforts increased. And shortly after that, they required reservations because they were so booked. These tourism dollars, needless to say, were critical for the region, but the project also aligned with the district's regional SEDS regarding things like tourism and workforce development. So the moral of the story here is the rehabilitation of 3 historic steam engines is far from water lines and sewer lines and roads, but that's what the region needed, and EDA was able to assist. A few years ago, a local government also came to me, and they were looking at requesting construction dollars to construct a business incubator they were contemplating. After a long conversation we had, they actually decided to take a step back. And with the guidance we provide for business incubators, which by the way can also be found in the Build Back Better Notice of Funding Opportunity, they applied for a non-construction grant to do a deeper feasibility study and strategy, implementation strategy. So this non-construction analysis actually helped them realize the need for online cohorts and fundamentally changed their original idea of the physical space. But it set them up for a successful, more market-driven implementation. So just another example of non-cookie cutter projects or non-status quo, if you will. Lee, I'm sure you have a couple of examples that that fit into this life cycle and touch on some of these successful approaches or pitfalls even.
Absolutely. Thanks, Trisha. I appreciate it. The thing to remember is, as Trisha said, is EDA supports the bottoms up approach to economic development. So it's up to the communities, it's up to the local economic development organizations to really define and support their particular cluster or project, and then bring in the necessary resources around it to help EDA get a good picture of what makes a competitive project and if we should fund it or not. As you know, I'm the Michigan EDR, and so I'm going to talk about a couple projects that we've done here in Michigan that have been extremely successful. Michigan, as most of you might know, is a pretty strong manufacturing state, given its strong connection to the automotive industry and its associated research and development. But it also has a very strong natural resource and agricultural base. After all, it is obviously the Great Lakes state. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about is a natural resource-based cluster that EDA supported in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, specifically in the northeast lower peninsula, which is a historically distressed region of the state. The region is known mostly for small manufacturing facilities that are affiliated with the auto industry, strong tourism economy, giving its connection to Lake Huron and the rivers and the forests located throughout the area. Does have a sound base of concrete manufacturing as well as timber processing. It's known locally as kind of like the jack pine area of the state, sandy soils. So we have a lot of softwoods that are grown in the region. Based on this natural resource asset of timber, I work directly with the Economic Development District in that region, Northeast Michigan Council of Governments, to conduct a feasibility study on timber opportunities in the region. That study came out pretty successful and identified ways in which we could foster and support additional job opportunities within the timber industry. Together with partnerships with the state of Michigan, local municipalities, and private wood companies, there was a defined need that there's a lack of critical infrastructure to support the growth of some of our timber operators in the northeast section of the state. As a result of this engagement, EDA worked with Beaver Creek Township and Grayling Township to support this expansion of a wastewater treatment system to accommodate this particular wood cluster. It leveraged ultimately a $4 million EDA investment, which is a significant investment in a rural area of northern Michigan. So why did we make this investment? So a couple things to think about. Assets. There's a strong wood stock. The private sector was defining the need that they needed this wastewater treatment capacity in order for it to grow and expand its operation. The feasibility study that was completed also supported this justification for supporting the infrastructure. The state of Michigan was at the table and was currently in the process of working to recruit a foreign-owned company into this rural region of the state. And also the USDA Rural Development stepped up to the plate to bring some match dollars. So we were leveraging state support with other federal agency support to potentially drive this project. As I mentioned, this is a historically distressed region, so that was another competitive factor for decision, and it was also consistent with the regional sets. So ultimately, EDA made this investment, but we did have some issues. The local municipalities, townships, pre-rural townships, don't have a lot of experience in wastewater treatment capacity or wastewater treatment operations. So we worked with them. They created a sewer authority, hired on some real expert folks to run that. And ultimately that helped ease our concerns of capacity issues from the operations standpoint of the facility. Again, the price tag was pretty large, $8 million for the project. But again, there was loan dollar commitments from USDA, so that made this project a bit more viable. So ultimately, what did this result in? Obviously, we have a certified operation from a wastewater treatment plant. We have now the largest particle press board plant in North America, located in northern Michigan. And hopefully that helps with some of our timber prices, lumber prices we're all dealing with on construction. The local community college, Kirtland Community College, located at the site next to these multiple private companies, and now has expanded workforce training into wood and timber processing. So that's been a huge success as well. And to date, the investment has created over 260 jobs and nearly 500 million in private investment as a result of this project that EDA was the catalytic funder for. So that is our timber industry and the cluster we supported. And I just want to touch on one more real quick, and hopefully we're doing all right on time.
Yeah. You have like a couple minutes on this, Lee.
All right, Andy, I'll move through
just to keep
quick.
you.
Thank you.
Because this is a great example. That's why I don't.
So as I mentioned, natural resources agriculture is one of our top industry clusters in the state. The project I want to talk about is a food processing investment that we make. Agriculture accounts for 22% of all jobs in the state of Michigan, and Michigan leads the nation in several crop production: asparagus, tart cherries, squash, some grapes. Michigan's agriculture contributes about $104 billion to the Michigan economy annually, second only in product diversity to California. Michigan also ranks third in the nation in the number of farmers markets. It has a very strong economic ecosystem when it comes to kind of local foods and food processing. However, there's a gap in this system. There's strong incubator networks, commercial kitchens, but there's no acceleration element. And so recognizing this gap, Michigan State University came to me to talk about ways in which we could work with stage 1 companies to upscale them into stage 2 operations. So enter into new markets, grow product diversification as it relates to food. As a result of that, Michigan State also had an existing network of currently at the time 8 kitchen incubators throughout the state that were all working directly with MSU. For those of you who don't know, Michigan State is a land grant institution that was founded on scientific agriculture. So food and ag is its history, its legacy. It has an entire professional staff associated with ag production and food processing. So it just made sense to work with that organization because of the fact that they have capacity. As a result of this defined need from the kitchen incubators, the entrepreneurs, existing businesses in the state of Michigan, EDA invested $2.5 million into Michigan State to build the Food Product Innovation Center. This center is a leading independent commercial food development, processing, packaging, and research facility, and it supports big and small business with state-of-the-art processing and packaging to support food processing opportunities. So again, why did we do it? Strong capacity for Michigan State to be able to carry out the project. They have existing network of need defined by the incubator tenants and the entrepreneurs that are looking for this resource. They also provided some strong business support for the project, beneficiary commitments, economic modeling that they provided to justify it to us. And they had a feasibility study completed on the values and operations of the particular innovation center. And it's consistent with Michigan's cluster. Weakness at the time was they didn't have a SEDS, right? So we hear about this is we need a SEDS for a project. Well, we were able to work and define a statewide alternative planning strategy that could justify and supplant EDA SEDS. So we were able to get past that. And at the beginning, Michigan only captured 40% of its food production potential. And now we're increasing that immensely. To date, we have 327 new jobs and $275 million in private investment that has occurred.
Great. I think what's great, what these examples, the reason we wanted to share these stories with you and these sort of very mini case studies, and as you can tell, we could spend, there's lots of these and that could be shared with you. But I think it highlights a few key things, at least in the conversations, and Lee and Trisha, jump in if I get this right. But, one is clearly, I think what you're hearing, and I think part of this message is that the EDRs and EDA, we're trying to be very creative, right, in working with regions through these challenges, right? And there was an entrepreneurial aspect. I mean, Trisha, what you talked about, right? Where would you end up buying steam engines, right? People would say, as you said, build a road, get a pipe, do this. That's not what, yes, you do that very well. You have a ton of capacity to do that. You're a civil engineer, you probably do it in your sleep. But the creativity to think about what are you trying to solve? The SEDS, what is your regional strategy? And as Lee said, even the creativity, if there's not a SEDS, we'll figure out, what is the economic development strategy you can align to or to create to give that justification? So there's an entrepreneurial aspect here about how to engage with EDA. Secondly, I think you heard very strongly, like some of these were very early efforts, right? Building an accelerator, betting on a sector, understanding that, yes, it's a big part of the economy, but how do we get there, right? Big from the capacity today to what we need to ramp up and scale up. And I think what I learned from talking to Lee and to Trisha is, don't be afraid of that. That's a good thing. Want to encourage you to be bold, to be visionary, but it needs to be backed up with really thoughtful feasibility. Demonstrate, why is this going to work? They're investors, EDA, right? They're investing in this. How are they going to justify that investment, right? How can you give them the confidence that will work? And even if you don't have the capacity today, who are your partners? How will you build capacity? What's the feasibility of the project? So willing to be bold, but need to match it with some really, really thoughtful strategic work. And then I think Lee pointed out, the role of anchors. I mean, that's what we're talking about here with the whole cluster approach and with the BBRC, right? The university anchor that Lee talked about, critical partners bringing those anchors in. May not always be a university. There's also corporate anchors. There are many different forms of anchors. But if you have that network, you can leverage those universities, leverage those anchors, courts, hospitals, eds, meds, universities, they take different forms in different places, but finding anchor institutions, finding partner institutions if you don't have the capacity. So I think there are a lot of lessons in these even very quick stories to build on. So I want to turn, I'm sorry, because we're just going to hit, and I say this for Lee and Trisha, when we had about 7 project elements, but I think given the time, we're going to do 3. And I hope I get the right 3, but because this leads right to getting the right co-applicant and the capacity to execute, right? These are really at the core. We've talked high level, talked about governance, how important that is, but here we're talking about the capacity to execute, getting the right co-applicants. So I think it would be helpful to share some insights about co-applicants, why that's so important, and what you have looked for in terms of the capacity to execute. Because the only thing I'd say is these are long-term projects, right? And you have to think long-term about sustainability. So Lee, Trisha, I don't know who would like to kick off. I'll leave to.
Go ahead, Trisha.
Oh, were you?
Yeah, Trisha, go ahead.
I'll go if you don't.
Oh, go ahead,
Go ahead.
So I think when it comes to understanding applicants, I'll focus probably on the non-construction side, and I'll let Trisha talk about the construction side. So it's important to understand eligible applicants to EDA. Eligible applicants include local units of government, special units of government, or nonprofits working with local municipalities. Tribal governments are also eligible for EDA investment. We also have some new tribal rules that came out that allows for wholly owned subsidiaries of tribes to be applicants as well. A lot of times universities, community colleges, state entities are all eligible for EDA investment. So keep that in mind when you're trying to put together your component projects for the Build Back Better. Applicants cannot be private sector. And that can be a very difficult scenario for EDA to work through. However, there are ways in which you can move forward on a non-construction project to make a project work. And I'll try to talk about that in here. If you're working on a project in which you're looking to build capacity from a business acceleration standpoint or business service standpoint, like operating an incubator, or like I said, doing outreach for maybe commercialization, tech transfer. So you always need to think about who's doing that work. How is this scope of work going to be implemented? Because defining how that scope of work is implemented is going to determine who the applicant has to be to EDA. So if you have a local municipality that's taking the lead on the project and they have a local planner that's going to assist in helping businesses with draft business plans, that city's an eligible applicant, they can charge their staff time to the project, everything's okay. But what if that applicant doesn't have adequate capacity to carry out that scope of work that you've defined? So who's going to carry it out? There's a couple ways to look at that. It's bringing in critical partners. So maybe you need to work with a community college. Maybe you need to work with your nonprofit EDO, economic development organization. Bring them on as partners because they're all eligible. Now, if you're looking at putting it into the private markets, you can do that. However, that has to go through a competitive procurement process. So you can use consultants to help you carry out the work. EDA frowns significantly on sole source procurement unless there is a strong justification for that. And I won't get too far into that because I think we'll talk a little bit about that maybe a little later. But understanding, so the fundamental comment here is understanding is how your scope of work is going to be implemented. And based on who's going to do that work, either has to be a co-applicant to this project or has to be defined as a consultant and go through a competitive bid process.
Right.
Hopefully that's understandable.
That's helpful. Tricia, is there anything you'd like to add on the non-construction side?
Well, actually,
Or on
the
the
construction piece too, frankly, for, you know, as far as getting the right co-applicants. I learned of a construction component project in our region that just added a coalition member because that entity owns the land where the project will likely be built. Of course, they'll also play a role in the cultivation of that cluster, but a great point as far as getting the right co-applicants. As far as the capacity to execute, I think a good example here is could be if an applicant is a new nonprofit, for example. You may not have the experience with federal grants, and that's okay, but demonstrate to us your plan for capacity and sustainability. Maybe you, as Lee mentioned, maybe you can even partner with the Economic Development District in your region to help out with things like post-award monitoring. So great points.
Great. I think both of you said some really important points. I think one of them for people is we have many different, very broad coalitions in many different places. And I think the important thing, what you're saying is, one, figure out who's actually executing and where that fits in the co-application process to make sure they're a part of it in terms of there's clarity on that. Secondly, you're not saying if you don't have the capacity, you automatically can't do it, but you have to show how you're going to build that capacity. Because remember, these projects are going to, by definition, building a cluster, construction projects, what we're looking for in terms of big impact is longer term. So how are you going to sustain that? There's obviously the governance component. There are other sessions on that in terms of the overall organization of coalitions, but down at the ground level, what we're talking about is making sure the people matter and the structure matters. And finally, I'd say that I think it's a really good point of if you don't have the capacity, who can you bring in? It is, I think, to your example, is it's not too late. People can be brought in. You discover the city owns the land, get them to the table. That makes your application even stronger. So I want to move because that leads us right to for a couple more of these topics on the life cycle. Let's talk about land. This is a big one. I know in our conversations, this can be like a number one issue that can really kill a project, so to speak, right? Kill a proposal. So let's talk about that. And Lee, why don't you frame for us, the sort of land and building process and how you've seen it and where you've seen some pitfalls.
Yeah, so understanding it, specifically when you're looking at a construction project, it's important to understand who controls the land, who might control the infrastructure that's going into the land, because all of that is going to determine who has to be applicants to EDA. Again, if that land is privately held, that presents some obstacles for EDA, and I would encourage you to reach out to your EDR and talk about ways in which you could work through those potential obstacles. But I like to say, whatever EDA is funding, in terms of where it's located and where it's going, we need to look at those two elements to figure out who a potential applicant can be. And then Trisha, maybe you want to talk about some of the issues we run to in terms of encumbrances and stuff when we're dealing with specific lands.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of different scenarios and complex arrangements when it comes to land control, ownership and leases, et cetera. And the EDRs will generally engage our regional legal counsel to help navigate those waters. But let's say one of your component projects is to build a building or renovate an existing one. So if you're going to build a building, EDA will require a first lien or mortgage on that facility for 20 years. For a renovation, we will require a first lien for 15 years. There are circumstances where this may not apply, like if state law prohibits an entity from giving EDA a first lien, But these are some of the things that you need to know or you need to think about up front or talk to your EDR about right now, because ultimately this could affect your acquisition. This could even complicate your financing. Also, if you're thinking about constructing a facility, remember it has to be available or utilized by multiple companies or beneficiaries. It cannot be just for one private company if that's kind of the angle that you're going. So check with your EDR so that there is clarity on your overall strategy when it comes to buildings.
Right.
Another quick note on land control. Land acquisition is generally eligible as part of the project, but there are certain restrictions that you should absolutely discuss with your EDR.
So I think the point, if I just keeping us moving, sorry, I don't mean to cut you guys off, there's so much information to share, is land can be complicated, obviously. It's a number one big issue that gets a lot of scrutiny and attention, understandably, because it's often the key to the success of the project. So the due diligence on land control, land acquisition, the encumbrances that may be there, how the EDA financing, the liens affect your financing. You're thinking all that through. And this, again, is not to frighten anyone. It is to say, this is what your EDRs and EDA are there to do. You don't have to figure this out by yourself. It's a complicated issue. We flag it because land control is a big issue, and it'll help you through that feasibility and that process. I want to turn and I'm just going to highlight, Lee, I'm just going to quickly highlight this just to say, similar with that is understanding your environmental and land use regulatory process, very important. I'm sure saying the obvious, but the timelines of that are important. Understanding if there are federal, if there are local environmental regulations, zoning. Do you need to rezone your site? Has the city put in a letter saying they'll support your rezoning? All these things, because they have huge implications for timeline. So really thinking through, the reason we called it project life cycle is, do I need land? Do I have what are the regulatory approvals? When can I actually deliver? And how does this affect my financing? Thinking through as a whole system. The last point on the project life cycle before we step back with the time we have on a couple strategic issues is, Trisha, talk to us about match. Now, I know in our conversations, everyone says, I got that, match. Yep, we get it. We got to have our match. Here it is, tick the box. And what you said I thought was interesting is how many times you review that match and have to send it back for revisions and reviews, and how it doesn't meet that, even though everybody thinks they get what that is. So talk to us about the magic sentence and the lessons on match.
Yeah, so you've heard over and over the importance of match, and match really is fundamental, especially for your cash commitments. The match documentation is critical. I can't tell you how many times we need to reach out to applicants to revise their match letters because they must contain specific information and real specific language. So first, you must have a match letter from each source. If you have two cash injections, two different sources, then you must have two separate letters signed by two separate entities. You need to include the exact amount, whether it's cash or in kind for non-construction projects. And the language needs to confirm. Now jot this down because every letter needs to contain this language. If it doesn't, it will be legally insufficient. So every letter needs to confirm that the match is available, unencumbered, and committed to the project. Okay, one more time. The match needs to be available, unencumbered, and committed to the project. Other federal funds generally cannot be considered as matching funds, but sources like CDBG or Community Development Block Grants, which originates from HUD, but loses its federal identity in most cases, can be used as match, but check with your EDR in those circumstances. Match commitments from the private sector and even the state is also eligible and can actually add to the competitiveness of your project.
Great. Lee,
Trisha,
like to add?
Yeah, I'll just jump in a couple things. I think in terms of federal dollars, I would talk to your EDR about the potential for ARPA dollars being able to be used as a potential match source. There's been some new rulings associated with the U.S. Treasury around that. So definitely talk to your EDR about that. couple things. If you're getting grant dollars on your projects, EDA is going to at least need to see that executed grant agreement before award. So if you're moving through that process to get grants, get on it. Hopefully you can get some sort of letter of commitment from the state or other agency for the project. Federal loans are eligible as match on a project, specifically USDA rural development. We work with them quite a bit, so keep that in mind. I just want to reiterate one other thing that Trisha said is you cannot use in-kind on construction projects. You cannot use in-kind on construction projects. So that's another hurdle that we run into a lot. And then on the non-construction projects too, if you're looking to use indirect costs, you need to have a negotiated indirect cost agreement that is current, or if you've never had one, you can use the de minimis rates. And again, talk to the EDR, your EDR about that. It's very important for the match purposes.
Yeah, great. So let's turn, it's 12:10. So for the next 10 minutes, I want to kind of, let's just step back. We've gotten sort of down into some very specific issues that are important, and there are others, but highlighting some of the big ones for people to think about. Stepping back and looking kind of strategically at proposals from your experience and the process. There's the big picture of how do you make the case for projects, right? And where are there often gaps in proposals, in the project narratives? You know, there's the criteria in the NOFA, you know, demonstrating, right, why EDA funding is essential, right? It is the but-for question. And we're not going to answer the but-for question, but it gets to the heart of what does the EDA funding do and where there are often gaps in that. And a couple, I just like both of you to sort of stepping back, a couple of the big things that you've seen, people trying to make cases for stronger projects or where they fall down in making that case. And maybe Trisha, you had a great line in our conversation. You said, show, don't tell, right? Everyone thinks they've got a unique project, right? My project's unique, right? And it's really special. And that is all true. All your projects are unique and special because they're incredible projects. What do they then have to do to demonstrate what that means to you that's compelling?
Yeah, that's perfect. So there's, like you mentioned, that show, don't tell angle. And like you said too, each project is going to be out of the box. Every project is going to be the only one in the country to do this. But show us what makes your project stand out. Show us, for example, in a construction project, that it's private sector commitment driven. Include those beneficiary letters that are committed to creating X number of jobs if the EDA makes this investment. You know, for incubator type projects or construction workforce development projects, you may not be able to demonstrate that private sector commitment, but your diligence in showing us the feasibility and analysis piece will help demonstrate the need. And furthermore, there might be a need, but is there a sustainable demand? So those are just a couple of angles. And Lee, I don't know if you want to talk maybe about the criteria in the NOFO or, you know, kind of economic justification.
Yeah, thanks, Trisha. So, you know, I can't stress enough to the folks on the call is remember who you're applying to, right? This is the Economic Development Administration. So your projects need to foster and support economic development opportunities. And as Trisha said, definitely private sector support for a project, in my opinion, is probably the most critical element that you can define to move the competitiveness of your application forward. Traditionally, EDA looks at the creation of high skill, high wage jobs and leveraging of private sector investment as a result of our projects. That's the commitment from the private sector, signing on to applications through the ED 900B forms, which is part of the application process. But I don't want you guys to lose sight of what the reviewers are going to look at. On page 35 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the Build Back Better, there is a list of criteria of nine selection factors that the investment team is going to look at. Really digest those, really incorporate those into your narrative. That's going to help you immensely. So don't lose sight of those. But I agree with Trisha. You know, is this project feasible? A lot of times you'll see in the written narrative that communities will talk about, yes, we're distressed. And here's some of our statistics to support it, which is great. You should include that. But you fail to connect how the distressed community is going to benefit from the proposed project. Why? Why should EDA make an investment in this community and in this project? How is it going to turn the table? How is it going to serve underserved communities? And really pulling that out of your narrative is going to be very, very important. In addition to that is, how is this project fit within the existing ecosystem of the economy? So I get a lot, of requests for incubators. I mean, everyone thinks an incubator is going to solve their economic woes by it's going to create opportunities for entrepreneurs. They absolutely do help. The problem is there's not a lot of thought process that sometimes goes into that, because incubators are very difficult to sustain from an operations perspective long term. But if you've done that feasibility study, that analysis that shows that, yeah, this will fit, and it will fit within the existing ecosystem, because there's probably other incubators in the region. So how does this complement? And that's what we're always looking for, is how does it build up everything within the region or anything within that industry cluster to kind of support that economic growth opportunity. Last thing I want to point out is the complementary types of investments. So look at projects that, but for the EDA project, this other investment will occur. So again, connecting in that ecosystem and how this project that you're asking EDA to invest in is going to be a catalyst for these other potential resources or opportunities within the region. I'll also point out strategic partnerships. You really have to have a sound understanding of you're working with the appropriate people to make the project successful. Could be from just even operational capacity for the project to the implementation of the project. So make sure you have the right partners, be it maybe your local accelerator, your local community college, your hospital system, whatever it is. Just make sure you've really thought that through, and those partners are at the table, and that's defined through some sort of letter of support commitment to the project. And don't forget about EDA's investment priorities. There are 7 of them. Now, everybody likes to write that their project is consistent with every single 7 investment priorities. And honestly, that's not the case. You really need to correlate how your project is specifically addressing that priority. And if it is, awesome, write about it. If not, then just leave it out. Just don't include it just because you think it's going to get you more points or something with EDA if you reference it. You really have to correlate how your project is going to benefit those investment priorities. And then lastly, I'll just close and say, remember the SEDS. Don't forget the comprehensive economic development strategy. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, you really need to have a conversation with your EDR. It's important. We always do look for SEDS consistency on projects, because that's who we fund at the local level. Our boots on the ground kind of help us EDRs navigate the economic development resources and opportunities. So those are just a couple things that I have to point out. It relates to how to build a strong case for an application. Hopefully that's helpful. If not, talk to your EDR. They'll be able to help.
I'm sure it is. So in the few minutes we have, about 5 or so minutes, 7 minutes, I want to turn and in our close, because there's a lot here. And the idea again was, just to highlight a few of the big issues that 2 very experienced EDRs have seen through many different processes, and to communicate how they can work with you on these issues. This isn't just putting it back to you, right? I'm sure you've now, I've beaten that to death, but that's the theme here. In these last minutes, let's talk about how you can effectively engage with the EDRs and the local regions. Many of you are already, obviously, but there's some learning here already in terms of what engagement's been successful. I thought we'd share a couple of examples. Trisha, you've had a couple of recent ways that regions have organized to really effectively tap into your resources and your expertise. Maybe you can share that, and Lee as well, for our wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm involved in a minimum of 1 meeting a week with the coalitions in my area. It's important to involve the EDR in this type of communication. Most of the time, the EDR may be in listen mode only, but if the coalition gets stuck or they have any questions, the EDR can help untangle things. If the EDR hears any potential red flags, the EDR will speak up out immediately and identify those potential barriers, and then help find a resolution. Wanted to mention too that, you know, one of the coalitions in my region needed to dive deeper in land control because of the options they were contemplating. So I suggested that we compile these questions from each component project. And we recently had a virtual meeting with the legal team out of the Austin regional office to address those questions. So engage with your EDR if you haven't already heard that. Lee, I don't know if you have any examples.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Trisha. I'm doing very similar things in the Chicago region in Michigan. I'm meeting weekly with my Build Back Better recipient. I think a lot of my other colleagues are doing the same. And if you aren't engaging your EDR as frequently as probably once a week, you probably should. One of the things that we've been doing in the CRO, Chicago Regional Office, sorry, those federal acronyms, is we are also bringing in our legal team, our engineering team, our environmental officers to kind of help navigate early on in this process, right? I know we only have 5 weeks now before you got to get to these phase 2 applications. So you really need to be thinking now about how to move these projects forward. And so we're bringing them in, we're bringing our engineers in to talk procurement. We're bringing our environmental officers to talk about what sort of NEPA hurdles you might have associated with your project. So really engage them. And I do want to give a shout out to our entire EDA family. There's a couple, the EDRs are forward facing, but we sure have a lot of people behind us that help us navigate through all of the policies and the paperwork and all the necessary components to bring projects to fruition. So to a shout out to our economic development specialists, to our legal counsels, to our environmental officers, our administration. And if I missed any, I apologize, but we are a team. We are trying to help you make successful applications. Again, as I mentioned, we're hands-on, trying to help. Please tap into our resources to make your projects successful.
That's great.
Well said.
In the couple, I want to, we have a couple of minutes left, and I want to say one thing I've taken away from my conversations with you is we've gotten down into the weeds. We've talked about some very specific issues, right? Land control and match and a number of things that are absolutely critical, right, for these applications to be successful, your proposals. But stepping back, what I've heard a lot is we really want you to be visionary. I mean, the goal here is economic development in regions and helping communities that have experienced distress, as Lee put. And so the creativity, the goal here is, yes, there is a lot to comply with. There's a lot to figure out. There's a lot to justify, but it's not just done any way to deter, I think, anyone, right? I don't want to speak for the two of you. Being bold, both of your stories where we went back and started, we're being bold and visionary about the transformation of the regional economy. What may have started as a food, incubator and scaled up, right? Or, wood processing to power plants or steam engines to, transforming the economy. All these things are about, fundamentally, that's what the mission is here. And this is to help you with that process, but not lose sight of that. I think I've heard that what you're excited about and what EDA wants to do in the EDRs help you to creatively problem solve and be effective in doing that. So in the 2 minutes we have, I'd really like to give Lee and Trisha, if you have 1 minute, if there's anything that you didn't get to share, anything you'd like to share, I think it's appropriate we kind of end with some closing thoughts from the two of you.
I'll kick it off by kind of reiterating what you just said. You've heard over the past couple of days, this amazing opportunity with the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. And what EDRs try and help or try and do is encourage you to, you've heard that word visionary a lot today too. Almost think of yourself 10 years out. 10 years from now, what should you have done 10 years ago with that EDA opportunity or with those projects? So be forward thinking, be innovative, creative, and inclusive. And that's pretty much it for me.
No, that's
Wonderful.
great. That's
That's
great,
great.
Trisha.
Lee?
You know, the thing I'll say is be who you are and grow that. You know your assets, you know your opportunities, support that, justify it, and hopefully EDA will make you a phase 2 award winner. So just step out of your comfort zone, but understand that that comfort zone is supported from the ground level.
I think that's a great message. And I think both of you used a word in our conversations, which was authenticity, right? This is from the ground up, the authenticity of what you're trying to accomplish in your economies and your communities, the processes you're setting up for the long term. And this being a process that's really about the whole ecosystem requires a creativity and a boldness and a thoughtfulness, and your partner's here to do it. So I think with that, we're going to give folks a few minutes for their coffee before the next sessions. And I just want to thank both Trisha and Lee, and shout out also to Alex and to Scott and putting this session together. We spent a lot of time together to try to make this as helpful, and Lee and Trisha spent a lot of time reflecting on their experiences, and it's wonderful you took the time to share it with us today. So everyone have a successful rest of the conference, and direct your questions to your EDRs in your local regions. Thank you.